Have you ever noticed how the most spiritually aware people in your life seem to carefully guard their solitude? Carl Jung discovered something disturbing about individuals who have done the deep psychological work of awakening. They don't avoid visitors because they're antisocial or superior. They avoid them because contact with unconscious people poses a genuine threat to their hard-won psychological integration. Today, I'm revealing why spiritually awake individuals protect their space so fiercely, and why Jung believed this wasn't just preference, but psychological necessity. Jung spent decades observing a pattern that made him deeply uncomfortable. Patients who had successfully completed what he called individuation, those who had integrated their shadow and differentiated their consciousness from the collective unconscious, consistently developed an aversion to casual social contact. These weren't misanthropes or hermits. They were psychologically complete individuals who had learned through painful experience that opening their doors to the wrong people could undo years of inner work in a matter of hours. The spiritually awake person has developed what Jung called differentiated perception. They can read the unconscious contents of others with startling accuracy. They sense the hidden emotions behind social masks, detect lies instantly, and feel the psychological atmosphere of every room they enter. This heightened awareness isn't a spiritual gift. It's the natural result of doing shadow work so thoroughly that you can recognize in others what you've already confronted in yourself. But here's what Jung discovered that disturbed him most. This superior perception creates a dangerous vulnerability. When spiritually awake individuals interact with unconscious people, something terrible happens. They don't just observe the other person's psychological state, they absorb it. Jung documented this phenomenon extensively in his clinical work, calling it participation mystique. The boundaries between self and other dissolve, and the awake person becomes flooded with unconscious material that isn't their own. Imagine spending years excavating your shadow, integrating your darkness, and establishing clear boundaries between your authentic self and the masks you wear socially. You've done the excruciating work of becoming psychologically whole. Then someone visits your home, someone who hasn't done any inner work, someone still completely identified with their persona and projecting their shadow onto everyone around them. Within minutes of contact, you feel their unintegrated anxiety seeping into your nervous system. Their repressed rage starts activating your body. Their unconscious neediness begins draining your energy reserves. You're no longer in your own psychological space. You've been invaded by contents that took you years to clear from your own psyche. This is why the spiritually awake don't like visitors. It's not snobbery, it's self-preservation. Jung identified the primary threat as shadow projection. When an unconscious person encounters someone who has integrated their shadow, they unconsciously attack what they see. The awake person becomes a mirror, reflecting back everything the visitor refuses to acknowledge in themselves. Instead of looking at their own reflection and doing their own shadow work, most people attack the mirror. Jung documented case after case of individuated patients being systematically destroyed by relationships with unconscious family members, friends, and colleagues. A woman who had integrated her capacity for anger would be accused of being hostile and aggressive by family members who had never examined their own rage. A man who had accepted his vulnerability would be attacked as weak by friends who armored themselves against their own sensitivity. The accusations weren't random. They were surgical strikes targeting exactly what the projector most feared in themselves. The spiritually awake person sees this happening in real time. They watch visitors project their unlived life onto them, twisting every word and gesture to fit the projection. And here's what makes this so psychologically dangerous. The projector speaks with absolute conviction. They're not consciously lying. Their brain has literally rewritten reality to support their distorted perceptions. This conviction creates what Jung called reality distortion fields. the projector doesn't just see you incorrectly. They convince others to see you through their distorted lens. Suddenly you're defending yourself against accusations that have no basis in your actual thoughts, feelings, or intentions. You're being attacked for motivations you never had, emotions you never felt, character flaws that exist only in the projector's unconscious. And the more you try to correct their misperceptions, the more convinced they become. Your attempts at clarification are interpreted as manipulation. Your boundary setting is seen as aggression. Your refusal to accept their projection is taken as proof of your guilt. This is the nightmare scenario that awakened individuals learn to avoid. They're not refusing visitors because they think they're better than others. They're protecting their consciousness from contamination by unintegrated shadow material. Jung emphasized that this wasn't theoretical danger. He witnessed individuated patients lose years of psychological progress after extended contact with unconscious family members during holidays or visits. The mechanism is insidious. When you're spiritually awake, your psyche has been cleared of unconscious debris. You've created space for authentic self-expression by removing the programming, trauma responses, and inherited patterns that once controlled you. But this psychological clarity makes you extraordinarily sensitive to foreign content. You're like someone who has cleaned their home so thoroughly they can immediately smell when something's rotting. Except what's rotting is the visitor's unexamined shadow, and you're not just smelling it, you're absorbing it into your system. Jung used the term feeling intuitive type to describe individuals who don't just perceive others' emotions, but feel them in their own bodies. These people had learned through bitter experience that they needed strict boundaries around who entered their physical space. Without these boundaries, they would spend days after a visit processing emotional material that didn't belong to them, working to distinguish their authentic feelings from what they had absorbed from the visitor. Jung documented a particularly disturbing case of a patient who had spent 3 years in analysis, successfully integrating her shadow and establishing clear boundaries. During a family gathering that lasted only 4 hours, she found herself regressing into childhood emotional patterns she thought she had resolved. Her brother's unprocessed grief became her depression. Her mother's repressed rage manifested as unexplained anger in her own body. Her father's silent disappointment settled into her chest as physical heaviness she couldn't shake. Within days, she was experiencing panic attacks she hadn't had in years, not because her own trauma had returned, but because she had absorbed her family's unintegrated psychological material. She described the experience to Jung as feeling like someone had dumped toxic waste into a clean river. Everything she had worked so hard to purify was suddenly contaminated again. The clarity she had fought for was replaced by the familiar fog of confusion and emotional chaos. Her sleep became disturbed. Her appetite disappeared. Her ability to concentrate vanished. And the most disturbing part was that she could feel exactly which emotions belonged to which family member, yet she was powerless to stop absorbing them once the process had begun. It took her 6 weeks of intensive work to clear what she had absorbed in 4 hours of contact. 6 weeks to restore what had taken 3 years to build. This case revealed something crucial to Jung about the nature of consciousness and its fragility. The spiritually awake aren't just sensitive, they're porous. Their heightened awareness means they lack the psychological defenses that unconscious people use to block out unwanted material. Those defenses, denial, repression, projection, may be unhealthy in the long term, but they serve a protective function. They keep you from feeling everything all the time. The awakened person has dismantled these defenses through shadow work, which means they're now experiencing reality without filters. This unfiltered experience is both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability. The spiritually awake also avoid specific types of visitors that Jung identified as particularly dangerous. The first is the inflated ego. These individuals are certain of their own righteousness, while being completely blind to their shadow. They walk into your space, radiating unconscious superiority, and their presence feels suffocating. They don't come to connect. They come to teach, correct, or save you from whatever they've projected onto you. The awakened person recognizes this immediately and knows that engaging will only strengthen the visitor's inflation while draining their own energy. When the inflated ego visits, they might compliment your home while subtly suggesting how they would have done it better. They ask about your life not out of genuine curiosity, but to find opportunities to share their superior wisdom. Every conversation becomes a teaching moment where they are the teacher and you are the perpetual student. They speak with unshakable certainty about subjects they barely understand, and they interpret any disagreement as evidence of your limited consciousness rather than their inflated self-perception. The awakened person feels their own knowing being undermined, their confidence being eroded by someone who mistakes certainty for consciousness. After such a visit, they feel diminished, doubting perceptions they know are accurate, questioning insights they know are valid. The second dangerous visitor type is the persona-identified individual. These people seem perfect on the surface. They say all the right things, display appropriate emotions, and maintain flawless social performance. But the awakened person feels something hollow beneath the performance. They sense the enormous pressure of repressed shadow material pushing against the facade. These visitors are psychological time bombs, and the awakened person knows that the explosion, when it comes, will damage everyone nearby. The persona-identified person brings an artificial quality into your space that's difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. Their smiles are technically correct, but emotionally empty. Their conversations follow perfect social scripts, but lack genuine spontaneity. They never have bad days, never express inappropriate emotions, never show human inconsistency. And this perfection is exhausting to be around, because the awakened person can feel the immense effort required to maintain it. They sense all the rage, grief, desire, and chaos being suppressed beneath the polished exterior. Worse, they know from experience that people who repress this much eventually experience catastrophic shadow eruptions. The more perfect the persona, the more violent the eventual breakdown. After these visitors leave, the awakened person feels disturbed by what they sensed lurking beneath the surface, and relieved they won't be present when that pressure finally explodes. The third type Jung warned about is the projection recruiter. These visitors don't just project their shadow onto you. They systematically try to get others to see you through their distorted lens. They arrive with seemingly innocent questions about your life, relationships, or choices, but they're actually gathering material to construct a narrative that supports their projections. Then they spread this narrative to mutual acquaintances, poisoning the social field before you even realize what's happened. The projection recruiter is perhaps the most dangerous because their damage extends beyond the immediate interaction. They might seem genuinely interested in understanding you, asking thoughtful questions and listening attentively. But the awakened person notices something predatory in their curiosity. They're not seeking connection. They're gathering ammunition. Every detail you share will be twisted and weaponized in conversations with others. They'll express concern about you to mutual friends, planting seeds of doubt about your character, your stability, your intentions. And they'll do it all from a place of apparent care and worry, making it nearly impossible for you to defend yourself without looking defensive or paranoid. The awakened person has learned to recognize these types instantly. They've been burned enough times to trust their perceptions completely. When someone triggers their internal warning system, they don't ignore it. They don't give people the benefit of the doubt. They don't try to be fair or open-minded. They simply decline to engage. No explanation offered, no justification provided, no debate entertained. just a firm boundary protecting their psychological integrity. But recognizing dangerous visitor types is only half the battle. Jung identified 5 unmistakable warning signs that reveal when someone is actively projecting their shadow onto you with dangerous conviction. These signs appear consistently across all 3 visitor types, and recognizing them early can save you from months of psychological contamination. The first warning sign is absolute certainty about your motivations. They don't say they think you might be a certain way. They pronounce what you are with complete conviction. They claim to know your internal states, your hidden intentions, your secret character flaws, and they state these claims as indisputable facts rather than interpretations or opinions. When you hear someone speaking about your inner world with more certainty than you yourself feel, you're witnessing projection, not perception. The second warning sign is immunity to contradictory evidence. No amount of explanation, clarification, or contrary evidence can shake their perceptions. If you try to correct their misunderstanding, they interpret your correction as further proof of their accuracy. If you provide evidence that contradicts their projection, they dismiss it as manipulation or deception. Their conviction is completely sealed off from reality testing. This imperviousness to facts reveals that they're not responding to you at all. They're responding to their own unconscious contents. The third warning sign is emotional intensity, disproportionate to evidence. They have massive emotional reactions to minor or non-existent slights. Their anger, hurt, or betrayal is enormous compared to whatever you actually said or did. This disproportionate response is the clearest signal that you're dealing with projection rather than genuine reaction. The intensity comes from their own unconscious material, not from your behavior. You're just the screen onto which they're projecting their internal drama. The fourth warning sign is consistent victim narratives. They're always the innocent wronged party in every conflict they describe. Every relationship that ended was the other person's fault. Every job they lost was due to someone else's incompetence or malice. Every friendship that dissolved happened because they were betrayed or abandoned. This pattern reveals someone who has never examined their own role in relationship failures, someone whose shadow is completely unintegrated and constantly being projected onto others. The fifth warning sign is recruitment behavior. They subtly or overtly try to get others to see you the way they do. They share their concerns about you with mutual friends. They ask leading questions designed to make others doubt your character. They create alliances against you based on shared perception of your flaws. This recruitment behavior transforms individual projection into collective possession, where entire groups begin seeing you through one person's distorted lens. And once projection becomes collective, it's nearly impossible to combat because you're no longer dealing with one person's unconscious material, but with a shared delusion that has taken on a life of its own. When you see these 5 signs together, you're not dealing with simple misunderstanding or personality conflict. You're facing unconscious shadow projection that will escalate until it destroys something: your reputation, your relationships, or your sanity. The only winning move is immediate withdrawal without explanation or negotiation. If you've ever felt your energy drain the moment certain people entered your space, write this in the comments: I protect my consciousness fiercely. This brings us to the climax of Jung's most disturbing insight about spiritually awake individuals. They must choose between engagement and integration. You cannot maintain your psychological wholeness while remaining fully accessible to unconscious people. The energy required to process and clear the shadow material you absorb from casual visitors is the same energy you need for your continued development. Every hour spent recovering from toxic social contact is an hour stolen from your individuation process. Jung realized that individuated people naturally create what he called psychological containers. These are internal structures that allow you to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily without being overwhelmed by them. But these containers have limits. Extend too much exposure to too many unconscious people, and even the strongest container will overflow. The awake person will find themselves flooded with anxiety, depression, rage, or despair that doesn't originate from their own psyche. They'll spend days or weeks clearing this material, effectively undoing their own development. When the spiritually awake ignore their boundaries out of guilt, obligation, or social pressure, the consequences are severe and immediate. Within hours of allowing an unconscious visitor into their space, they notice the familiar signs of contamination. Their thoughts become muddy and confused where they were once crystal clear. Their emotional stability dissolves into free-floating anxiety that has no apparent source. The peace they worked years to cultivate evaporates, replaced by the visitor's unprocessed chaos churning through their system like poison. The physical symptoms can be just as disturbing as the psychological ones. Unexplained fatigue that sleep doesn't cure. Tension headaches that appear out of nowhere. Digestive problems that have no medical cause. Body aches in places that weren't injured. The awakened person's body is responding to the energetic and psychological contamination, trying to process and expel material that doesn't belong, and the recovery time is brutal. What took minutes to absorb can take weeks to clear completely. But perhaps the most insidious consequence is the internal conflict that arises. The awakened person knows they should have trusted their intuition and refused the visit. They can feel that they've betrayed their own hard-won wisdom by prioritizing social obligation over self-preservation. This self-betrayal adds another layer of suffering to the contamination itself. They're not just dealing with absorbed shadow material. They're dealing with shame, guilt, and anger at themselves for ignoring what they knew to be true. This internal conflict can be more damaging than the original contamination because it undermines their trust in their own perceptions, which is the very foundation of their awakened state. This is why Jung emphasized the awakened person's greatest duty is to protect their consciousness, your spiritual awakening, your shadow integration, your psychological wholeness. These aren't achievements you accomplish once and forget about. They're states you must actively maintain through conscious discrimination. You must constantly evaluate what belongs to you and what belongs to others. You must rigorously guard the boundaries of your psyche against invasion by unconscious material. And yes, this means refusing visitors who threaten your integration. But the spiritually awake don't withdraw from all human contact. Jung was clear about this. They withdraw from unconsciousness. They create careful boundaries around who has access to their physical and psychological space. They maintain relationships with other individuated people, those engaged in their own shadow work, and those capable of meeting them with consciousness rather than projection. These relationships feed their development rather than threatening it. These connections honor their awareness rather than exploiting it. The awakened person develops a protocol for managing social contact that Jung documented across multiple cases. First, they trust their gut absolutely. If someone's presence feels draining, threatening, or contaminating, they trust that perception over social obligation or guilt. Their intuition has been honed through years of shadow work and countless experiences of ignoring it to their detriment. They no longer second-guess what their body and psyche are telling them about another person's energy. Second, they don't try to convince projectors of reality. They recognize that shadow projection is immune to contradictory evidence, and attempting to correct it only strengthens the projection. The projector's brain has literally rewritten reality to support their distorted perceptions, which means no amount of explanation or evidence will penetrate their conviction. The awakened person knows that engaging in this kind of reality negotiation is a trap that will only drain their energy and validate the projector's delusion. Third, they limit information flow. They don't share personal details with people who might weaponize them through projection or gossip. They've learned that every piece of information they reveal to an unconscious person becomes potential ammunition in a war they never agreed to fight. So they become strategically private, sharing their inner world only with people who have earned access through demonstrated consciousness and respect. Fourth, they seek outside perspective from trusted individuals who exist outside the projection field. When someone is projecting intensely, it can make you question your own reality. Having a few conscious witnesses who can confirm what you're actually experiencing versus what you're being accused of experiencing is crucial for maintaining your grip on truth. These reality anchors help the awakened person remember that the projector's distortions aren't real, even when they're being presented with absolute conviction. Fifth, and most importantly, they withdraw when necessary. Sometimes the only winning move is not to play. When someone shows the 5 unmistakable signs of dangerous shadow projection, the awakened person exits immediately, without explanation, negotiation, or backward glance. They've learned that their consciousness is too precious to sacrifice on the altar of social politeness or family obligation. This might sound cold or cruel to people who haven't done their own inner work, but Jung understood it as wisdom. The spiritually awake aren't withdrawing from life. They're withdrawing from unconsciousness. They're protecting something precious and hard-won. They're refusing to sacrifice their psychological integrity on the altar of social expectation. They've learned that their first responsibility is to their own consciousness, because only by maintaining their own wholeness can they serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious for others who are ready to do their own work. And here's what life looks like after implementing these boundaries successfully. The spiritually awake person experiences a profound peace that comes from selective engagement. They're no longer exhausted by social obligations that drain them. They're no longer confused by interactions that leave them questioning their own perceptions. They're no longer angry at themselves for betraying their intuition. Instead, they live in a carefully curated environment where their consciousness can flourish rather than merely survive. Their relationships become deeper and more meaningful because they're only maintaining connections with people capable of genuine consciousness. There's no more pretending, no more performing, no more managing other people's projections. When they interact with fellow awakened individuals, the conversation flows naturally between surface topics and profound depths. There's mutual respect for each other's boundaries. There's recognition of each other's shadow work. There's appreciation for the journey each person has undertaken to reach this level of awareness. These conscious relationships feel completely different from unconscious ones. There's an ease and authenticity that comes from being seen accurately rather than projected upon. There's reciprocity rather than one-sided emotional labor. There's growth and evolution rather than stagnation and drama. The awakened person finally understands what Jung meant when he said that quality of connection matters infinitely more than quantity. One conscious relationship nourishes the soul more than 100 unconscious ones. The spiritually awake don't dislike visitors because they're antisocial. They're selective about visitors because they've learned the terrible cost of unconscious contact. They've experienced how quickly years of inner work can be contaminated by hours of exposure to unintegrated shadow material. They've felt the exhaustion of processing emotions that don't belong to them. They've watched their energy get drained by projections they never participated in creating. And they've made the difficult but necessary choice to protect their consciousness above their popularity. Jung's final insight on this matter was profound. He recognized that the spiritually awake serve an essential evolutionary function. They are consciousness pioneers, living examples of what becomes possible when you do the shadow work most people avoid. But they can only serve this function by remaining integrated. The moment they sacrifice their boundaries to accommodate unconscious people, they lose their effectiveness. They become infected by the very unconsciousness they're meant to illuminate. So yes, the spiritually awake don't like visitors, not because they think they're better than others, not because they lack compassion or connection, but because they've learned through painful experience that their consciousness is both their greatest gift and their greatest responsibility. And protecting that gift sometimes means closing the door to people who would unconsciously destroy what they've worked so hard to build. This isn't cruelty, it's wisdom. And Jung believed it was absolutely necessary for both individual and collective psychological evolution. Comment below if you've learned that saying no to unconscious people is saying yes to your own wholeness. My boundaries are sacred. If you've recognized yourself in this description of the spiritually awake, know that your selectivity isn't a flaw. It's a feature of psychological maturity. Your boundaries aren't walls. They're containers protecting consciousness in a world that actively works to keep people unconscious. And if you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights into consciousness and shadow work, check out my video on 7 dangerous Carl Jung psychology places that destroy your mind, where I reveal the psychological environments that are particularly toxic for awakened individuals. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.